Imagine a wall so vast it stretches across countries. A wall not made for migrants, but for tanks. Estonia isn't just bracing for war, it's preparing to be the first battlefield. While much of the world has its eyes glued to Ukraine, Estonia is silently constructing what could become NATO's most critical line of defense, a vast military barricade against Russia, known as the Baltic Defense Line. 600 concrete bunkers, anti-tank trenches snaking through forests, a massive wall of steel and strategy. Built on fear, memory, and grim calculation. But here's what makes this so chilling. This isn't some abstract future plan, it's already happening. Ditches are being dug, bunkers are rising. And NATO troops are moving in. The quiet Baltic nation of Estonia, with just 1.3 million people, is doing what few dare, directly challenging Putin with a defensive gamble that could trigger a wider war or prevent one. But why now? Why Estonia? And what made NATO so desperate to harden its eastern front? To understand that, we need to go back, not just decades, but centuries, to a time when Estonia didn't exist on maps and Russia's shadow loomed large over the Baltics. This wall isn't just steel and stone, it's built on the ruins of Soviet history and the fear that history may repeat itself. Stick around. Because what you're about to hear is not a conspiracy, and it's not fiction. It's a blueprint for survival. And it all starts with the Soviet Union's collapse and three tiny nations that dared to defy Moscow. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't just leave behind broken statues and abandoned tanks. It left behind a burning question. What would happen to the countries that had been forcibly absorbed? Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, were never truly Soviet in spirit. They spoke their own languages, worshipped their own heroes. And deep down, even during the darkest Soviet years, they never gave up the belief that they'd be free again. So when the USSR began to wobble in the late 1980s, the Baltics didn't wait, they ran. While other Soviet republics hesitated, the Baltics demanded independence and took it. They were the first to break away, and they didn't look back. They didn't try to repair ties with Russia. They turned west toward democracy, capitalism, and NATO, and that was the moment they became a problem for Putin, because the Baltic states weren't just independent. They were proof, living, breathing proof, that you could leave the Russian orbit and thrive. That Russia wasn't necessary for success. That the Soviet dream was a lie. This wasn't just political. It was personal. Putin wasn't yet the iron-fisted autocrat we know today. But even in the early 2000s, he understood the threat, not military or ideological. He played it cool in interviews. Told Western journalists that countries had the right to choose their path, but behind closed doors, he watched and he waited. Because to him, the Baltics were a virus, spreading rebellion, democracy, and Western influence across Russia's borders, and viruses, in Putin's world, must be eradicated. But it wasn't Estonia's democracy that terrified Moscow. It was something far more dangerous, NATO knocking on Russia's front door. Asterisk. When Estonia joined NATO in 2004, it didn't just sign a treaty. It crossed a line, one that Vladimir Putin had hoped would never be breached. But here's the twist, he didn't seem to care. At least, not publicly. In interviews, he dodged the question. In 2001, he even suggested that Russia might one day join NATO itself, if the timing was right. Why so calm? Because at the time, Russia was broken. It was still recovering from the chaotic collapse of the 1990s, a decade of financial ruin, political instability, and to brutal wars in Chechnya. Putin had bigger problems at home than worrying about tiny Estonia joining a defensive alliance. But that calm was a smokescreen, because something changed in 2003. The year of the Rose Revolution in Georgia. A peaceful democratic uprising swept a pro-Western leader into power, and Putin blamed one country for it, the United States. That revolution became a turning point. To Putin, it wasn't just Georgia choosing democracy. It was the West infiltrating Russia's backyard. Again, from that moment forward, NATO wasn't just a military alliance. It was a political virus, threatening to rewrite the rules of the post-Soviet world. Estonia's NATO membership now looked like a beachhead, a staging ground for Western influence, 100 miles from St. Petersburg. And while NATO never fired a shot, the threat was ideological. NATO supported governments that opposed Moscow, NATO trained armies that refused to kneel. NATO became the symbol of everything Putin feared, a world where Russia was surrounded, not by tanks, but by ideas. But Putin wasn't worried about ideas alone. What came next made Estonia's peaceful border look like a battlefield in waiting. Asterisk. The illusion of peace shattered in 2014. That year, Russian troops, without insignias, swept into Crimea. In just days, they annexed an entire Ukrainian territory with barely a shot fired, and suddenly, everything Estonia feared felt real. If Russia could do that to Ukraine, what would stop it from doing the same to the Baltics? The difference on NATO. Estonia was a member. Ukraine wasn't, but even that shield had cracks, because after the invasion of Crimea, NATO ran a chilling series of war games. The results? Catastrophic. According to simulations from 2014 and 2015, Russian forces could take Tallinn, Estonia's capital, and Riga in Latvia in just 60 hours. Think about that. Two NATO capitals gone in less than 3 days before reinforcements could even be deployed. That meant one thing: Article 5, the sacred NATO clause that promises mutual defense, could be rendered meaningless. The message was loud and terrifying. NATO might not reach you in time. This changed everything for Estonia. They weren't just planning for war, they were planning for a war alone, at least in its opening hours. That's when the concept of total defense began to emerge. Not just an army, a nation ready to resist, a society trained to hold out until help arrived. And behind every strategy briefing, every map, and every simulation was the same nightmare vision: Russian tanks rolling through pine forests, tearing across empty roads, headed straight for the Estonian heart. But there's one stretch of land, just 60 miles wide, that could decide the fate of all 3 Baltic states, and Russia knows it. It's called the Suwałki Gap, and to military planners, it's Europe's most dangerous strip of land. Just 60 miles long. This narrow corridor straddles the border between Poland and Lithuania. On the map, it's just a minor stretch of farmland and forest, but in a war scenario, it's life or death for the Baltic states. Why? Because on one side of the Suwałki Gap sits Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian exclave with thousands of troops, long-range missiles, and a key naval port. On the other side, Belarus, now practically an extension of Putin's regime. If Russia captures the Suwałki Gap, it effectively seals off Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania from the rest of NATO. No troops, no reinforcements, no escape. This is NATO's Achilles heel. And Putin knows it. He doesn't need to occupy all of Estonia to win. He just needs to cut the cord. Estonia's leaders understand this all too well. That's why the Baltic Defense Line isn't just about bunkers on their own soil. It's about stalling, shaping, and buying time. They don't have the luxury of strategic depth. The distance between the front lines and their cities is measured in hours, not days. So if Russia comes, the response must be instant, or it's over. And that's what makes Estonia's preparation so urgent. They're not building defenses just to hold the line. They're building them to delay the inevitable long enough for the rest of NATO to wake up. But Estonia's not alone anymore. 2 new NATO members just changed the entire calculus, and one of them has a very personal score to settle with Russia. For years, the Baltics stood on the eastern edge of NATO, a lonely front line. But that changed in a seismic way when Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. And for Russia, that was a strategic disaster. With Finland's accession, NATO doubled its land border with Russia, from 754 miles to nearly 1,600. But this wasn't just about lines on a map. Finland has history with Russia, bitter, bloody history. During the Winter War of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland expecting a quick win. Instead, they got a brutal fight and staggering losses. And now, Finland is back, with a modern military, a deeply motivated population, and access to 15 military bases that NATO can use immediately. That means NATO doesn't need to wait for an invasion to respond. It can station troops, jets, and missiles right there, breathing down the neck of Russia's northwest flank. Sweden adds even more weight. Its powerful navy and advanced air force give NATO full control over the Baltic Sea, turning it from a Russian advantage into a NATO lake. Together, these 2 new allies form a northern wall, boxing Russia in and neutralizing its once dominant position in the region. For Estonia, this is game-changing. Because if the Suwałki Gap falls, reinforcements could now fly in from Finland, sail in from Sweden, and strike deep behind Russian lines. It's no longer just about holding the front. It's about flanking the invader, and while that gives hope, it also escalates the stakes, because now, if war erupts in Estonia, it drags everyone in, immediately. But the real shock came in 2022, when Putin made his deadliest move yet, and exposed a fatal weakness in Russia's grand plan.